Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of Prudent Observations. I am your amphibious host, the Prudentialist, covering all things with respects to foreign policy, the history of international relations, and just what on earth is going on in the world. Today, I'm joined again by the erudite and well-read Mr. George Bagby. George, how are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. Lovely to be back.
I'm very happy to have you back, and we're going to continue our discussion from the last time that Bagby was on, discussing William Appleman Williams, or Bill Williams as he went by in life, and his 1959 book, The Tragedy of American Diplomacy. We had gotten through quite a bit of the early history of his thesis that the sort of progenitor of American imperialism is the open door policy, that it has been primarily oriented around expanding access to foreign markets, that American policy has to sell its surpluses of manufacturing in order to maintain its economic stability, but also to maintain sort of a economic hegemony over rivaling empires. So we talked about a little bit last time the discussion over, what's the word I'm looking for? The issue over anti-imperialist imperialism, that they would decry the imperialism of other nations while pursuing it themselves. And here we are continuing that conversation as we start looking towards the Second World War and the early days of the Cold War.
I had a teaching moment today. Coincidentally, I have a small operation where I'm teaching online, and I was teaching geography today, and I was covering the Middle East, and I had a very brief span of time to talk about it, just because of the nature of the class. But I found myself talking about Iraq with my students several times today, and I found myself describing the story of recent conflict in Iraq as tragic in the Greek sense. Once again, I was telling my students about the former Christian population of Iraq. Something like 10% of the country was Christian back before the invasion in 2003. I described to them the outbreak of the civil war in Iraq that killed something like 1 million people once it was all over with. And I emphasized to my students that no one in the United States government ever intended any of that to happen. And on the contrary, they thought they were going to open the markets of Iraq by invading the country, toppling its government. They were going to spread democracy by force, right? But they also were very vocal in the Bush administration about how opening up the markets of Iraq to American capital and American consumer goods and such. They were talking about like the freedom of commerce to buy and sell American things, and American corporations coming in and investing in Iraq in various ways, that this was going to completely change the lives of everyday Iraqis for the better. And in fact, the whole thing degenerated into this particularly bloody and brutal civil war. There had not been a single suicide bombing in the history of Iraq until 2003. And then it became an everyday occurrence. We got so used to suicide bombings in Iraq with mass casualty events that we became numb to it. I know I'm a little older, but I remember it all very well, and just had a chance to reflect on that today, and thought to tie it into what we're talking about today. The point of our conversation is not to denigrate American policy as such, but to try to diagnose where it went wrong, because American policy is defined by high ideals that is always shining through. Even in the more cynical actors that we do encounter, we see they are they seem to be grounded in good ideas about what could be done in the world, or they want to do good in the world. Let's put it that way. They really do want to do good in the world. And Williams gives them that. He does describe them as humanitarian in their focus, right? Americans aren't interested in developing themselves at home. They are always interested in going abroad. They have kind of a missionary mindset in some sense.
Yeah, they certainly do. And this is what we discussed about last week, especially, is that there was this mindset that sort of combined this desire to expand American industry alongside the sort of progressive, Unitarian idea that we can universalize the goodness of our society and take it out there. Um, and this is ran into, as Williams points out both in this book and his second book at the end of the Vietnam War, Empire is a Way of Life, that this does lead to unsustainable conclusions and that things have to be reformed. However, of course, like many sort of when it comes to American foreign policy, people like Williams or Kennan or more recently, I guess in contemporary issues, everyone from Pat Buchanan to John J. Mearsheimer, they're more so like Cassandra than anything else. Is that they tell out sort of a tragic tale and then warn what is to come, and then it never falls on anyone's ears of particularly of an importance. Mearsheimer had famously said in an interview a few years ago that no one from the government ever really asked him about his policy or what he thought needed to be done with American foreign policy. And as a man who has had such a monumental influence in the discipline of international relations, to never be talked to by the government or to be laughing and saying that no one's ever really listened to you or taken you seriously from the higher ups of the State Department is rather interesting. And
It's
so in
very
this,
blackpilling
it is.
because you could take his advice and reject it,
Yeah,
right?
but
You
you
could
have
you
to
could
listen
just
to it first.
consider it in conversation at Foggy Bottom and say, yeah, well, that's Mearsheimer, all in favor say aye, and just move on. But the fact that they never consult him, it explains a lot about the delusions of the State Department these days. It's not part of their thought. They've deliberately walled themselves off from realist perspectives on foreign policy, which, if I was a betting man, I would bet on further deep embarrassments for United States foreign policy. Uh, they will be embarrassed. They will be uh, smeared with dung until they can accept new ideas. And there's a kind of anti-intellectualism baked into that institutional structure, that they will refuse to speak to those outside of their own circles, or they pillory them as well. They accuse them of wickedness for having ideas different than those of the establishment, and that it's become a ridiculous hubris in our own day. I mean, there was more conversation in the Bush administration. There were actually minority opinions about the war on terror, for instance. Not that you could see any of that dissent in Congress, but not initially anyway, right? But eventually you could detect there were people in the administration that objected to things like the war on terror and offered alternatives. They weren't all hawks. In our day, it looks like everyone in the administration is a hawk. there are varieties of hawk. There seem to be hawks that are most interested in China and hawks that are most interested in Russia, but they aren't listening to anyone outside of their own set, and that is a sign of impending disaster and maybe doom for their plans.
Well,
Well,
I
with
think.
all
Go
oh,
ahead.
go ahead.
Well, what I was going to say is I think it's a good way to also contextualize where we're coming from with respects to this text and what we'll be going over, because this is published right before Kennedy's elected. This book is published right before the Cuban Revolution. Well, the Cuban Revolution sort of begins its to build up, but this is before Bay of Pigs, and most importantly, this is right before the Cuban Missile Crisis. And looking at it, and so he's not even the worst of what America's got going for it, because it's very interesting, because the book ends on two notes: one, how to actually fix the problem, but two, that nuclear supremacy in the Cold War does not matter, because, well, we'll get into that as we talk about this book. But in this instance, Williams highlights that, whether it be in his theory, of course, the open door policy is sort of the progenitor for this American economic expansionism, which builds up the other sort of theories around what imperialism is. You have to stretch very far to find non-market oriented explanations, and in fact some of the earliest editions of Reason magazine back in 1976 will give you that, but heaven forbid you see that now with Nick Gillespie and them running that magazine. But Williams is going to, as we get into the book now in full, we're going to see how this market oriented discussion, can we stay out of the war in World War II? Can we, find a way to maintain our own industry? Maybe we even aid, Hitler's Germany as well as Stalin's USSR and let them wipe each other both out. All these sort of discussions about, well, whatever keeps the fight away from us will do just fine. And he's going to spin you this rather interesting, and as we talked about last time he was on, this Greek tragedy of powerful people who had the best that they're going, only to at the end, find themselves enraptured in a world that no longer works for old ways of thinking. And in turn, that leads, every person looking at the market and looking at foreign policy and sanctions as nails, and using the sort of financial system, whether it be industry and manufacturing or later on in the 2020s and today, the finance and capital as a weapon and nothing else.
Indeed, and Williams chronicles the evolution of what we like to call soft power today as a tool of American diplomacy, a favorite tool of foreign policy abroad. And that's in contrast to a more forceful foreign policy, a leonine policy, a lion-like policy, which would involve using force. We see that United States foreign policy alternates in the time period that Williams covers between intervention with the Marines, say in Central and South America, um, and using things like the financial power of Wall Street, the cutting off of foreign aid, um, embargoes, things of that nature to influence policymaking in other countries and to avoid actually intervening in them. But Williams also says that these soft policies, the soft power of finance and uh, changing trade relationships and such, makes hard interventions inevitable, which is a really interesting, real interesting claim. That particular claim really stuck out to me, which it seems in contrast with received wisdom in our day. Who was the fellow that said that two countries with McDonald's never go to war with one another?
That would be Tom Friedman of the New York Times. back in
Okay.
the, and that was right before the bombing and America's involvement in Serbia and Kosovo, which also had McDonald's. So his thesis, was disproven like 4 months later.
Oh dear. But it still had a shelf life. I remember people talking about that for many years. People still talk about that. The idea that if you break down barriers for trade, and in particular, which is a curious feature of that particular argument, about McDonald's, if you let American businesses in, if there's an American corporate presence in that country, that makes that country exempt from the use of hard power somehow. Their interests become aligned with the interests of Wall Street and thus the interests of Washington, D.C. It does not bear out in experience, but it's still a very powerful idea that influences policymaking. Certainly did with the war on terror and the interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq. The Bush administration talked a lot about opening up those countries for American business, and this was going to pacify them. And this was going to decrease the importance of religious fanaticism in the policy of those countries, which of course it didn't. But it was as if the Bush administration was unaware that people thought about things other than consumer goods or quality of life. And we see that is a point that Williams returns to many times. He talks about the importance of quality of life, of increasing the quality of life in American foreign policy decisions, going all the way back to Herbert Hoover, who believed that commerce, that increased commerce and resultant increased standards of living in poorer countries would eventually secure peace for the whole world. It was actually a utopian idea, the idea that if people buy and sell more, if the quantities of goods increase, if the quality of life increases, then you will have less conflict in the world, which is, it seems to me, a fundamentally materialist proposition. Those that insisted on that formula for world peace, people like Andrew Carnegie, incidentally, and his famous Carnegie Endowment for World Peace, Andrew Carnegie and his Gospel of Wealth, um, has this really outsized influence on American policymakers. Williams does not mention Carnegie, but I see these ideas behind people like Herbert Hoover and his foreign policy statements. To increase the quality of life is going to bring about world peace is a materialist idea made by people who are unaware of spiritual needs. It's like they've never heard of them. They are completely blind to the irrational desires and necessities of the human spirit. They think if you put everyone in a warm house with plenty of amusements, a warm house with Netflix or something, then they will have no reason to fight. And that's insane. No observer of human beings would walk away with that conclusion, which makes me think, well, perhaps they just spent too much time with idealism in a library or something. But it's the origin of a lot of trouble. These decisions had great impact, and they had something to do with the incredible amount of violence that we see in the 20th century.
Yes, and I think that it's a good way to dig into the text itself now as a way to go on. We concluded last time, the other week, with the book, probably about halfway through. We finished off on what's called the chapter of isolate, or the legend of isolationism. And this is a big thesis that Williams makes both in this book and in Empire's A Way of Life, is that throughout the history of American foreign policy, from the Barbary states to the I get what you would call like the phony war between France and the United States prior or during its time with its post-revolutionary government. Uh, America had been adamantly involved in international affairs. And I have an episode on the war with the Barbary Pirates. If you're remotely interested in this, it was America's ability to get more involved in the Mediterranean and in Islamic territory, what would be close to the Middle East as we know it, to a point where the relatively Protestant America, where like 90% of the United States at the time is a Protestant background or of some kind of Protestantism, is given a blessing by the Pope himself for committing action to the Christian cause against the Mohammedans more than any other European or Catholic country at the time, which is sort of an interesting footnote in history. But he points this out that as America's manufacturing ability to expand and grow, which had been a discussion behind the sort of Hamiltonian Federalist camp of New England, which has still played a large role in the history of America. I mean, if you ever want to look at that domestically, you can take a look at the history of the Civil War. That, a big issue does come between the tariffs and industry of the North versus sort of that agrarian South and King Cotton diplomacy when it comes to the Southern agriculture. But Williams concludes with respects to his thesis being about, raw material producing areas are vitally important to the existing methods and processes of the American corporate economy. Now, this is right after World War I. And you're already looking at numerous areas and interest and interventions into the Middle East, into Saudi Arabia. And at the time, keep in mind, the House of Saud is just beginning to take power in the 1920s and 30s. We covered this with a gentleman named Hitman on this channel that you can look up, where we sort of explain that the House of Saud's rise is happening during, right after World War I as they begin to expand. They were actually paid by Lawrence of Arabia and the British government to just say, hey, we're taking care of the Ottoman Empire right now. We need you to hold off for a little bit. And at the same time, we're in Africa and led by individuals like Herbert Hoover and the rest. But he sort of concludes the chapter with this, and quote, "Far from being unimportant, therefore, the open door policy became increasingly more significant and crucial in the years after it was first enunciated by Secretary of State John Hay. The pattern of American expansion under the principles and procedures of the open door notes came to maturity during the 1920s, and it was the threat posed to that program by the combined impact of the Great Depression and the competing expansion of Germany and Japan, both of which gained strength by identifying themselves with one or more of the broad revolutions against, quote, classical liberalism, which ultimately accounted for America's entry into World War II." You're not going to get a particularly revisionist understanding of the war in this text from Williams. Also keep in mind of when it was published, but sort of vital to understand that for what he's going to highlight in these next sections is that the Great Depression threatens the entire foreign policy of the United States. When your policy is based on maintaining manufacturing, to sell surpluses to foreign markets, to access those foreign markets for raw materials and resources that you can bring back home, that sort of neo-mercantilism that we might have seen from the British Empire just a few centuries prior, now all of a sudden that's in threat. And you're seeing a resurgent Germany after World War I, and Japan looking further and eastward as well as westward with, its sort of co-prosperity sphere, trying to take advantage and getting access to various raw materials, and of course, infamously, this object of oil, which would help trigger a conflict between the United States and the Empire of Japan at that time, so on. But you have to understand, for Williams, the thesis really does start at this sort of progenitor original sin is the open door policy. When we finally say, we're done with just expanding to the rest of the continental United States. We've closed the frontier, as Frederick Jackson Turner said. Now we look further to the west. We look to China, and we look to the rest of the world. And from there, Williams tells this tragic tale. And now we're getting into an even larger tragedy, that of the Second World War.
And this theme of mercantilism is something that we can trace all the way back to Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. He's the first one to formulate the term and describe it, but it's already full grown at the time that he's writing about that. Adam Smith publishes his book in 1776. It's another famous event back in 1776. But he's also describing the function of the British Empire at that time. And if we think back to our our history of the war for independence, we know that the economic situation between the mother country and the American colonies is a point of tension. It's not the only thing going on that sparks the war for independence, but this is a major and long running dispute, and it's the colonial relationship that we see illustrated there that is a spark to conflict, a an impetus for fight for and ultimately for independence. um we see this sort of thing going on in the Americas with the United States as the instigator, and the fault is the open door policy. What we see is a new kind of colonial relationship, hence neo-mercantilism, right? It's a new kind of imperialism, if you will. And it's imperialism not in name, but in act or policy. And in chapter 4, the description of so-called isolationism, m Williams Williams says, "Oh, this period in the 1920s that's labeled isolationist is not. It's not isolationist. There are American opponents to, uh, empire building or neo-mercantilism in the Americas, but and they are vocal, members of the Senate, like, Senator Bora from Idaho, being a good example. But the policy of the presidents in this period, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, are still all imperialist in this sense. Coolidge is rather famous, even among libertarian sorts, for being the president that doesn't do very much, and I rather like him for that. He's certainly a character, but Coolidge does speak of the United States being the patron of humanity and a force of civilization in the world, and he uses this to justify more leonine policies, or actions in Central America, just as an example. He said, "Anyone that opposes United States interventions in Latin America are treading the way that leads to the jungle," which I thought was a particularly Anglo, way of putting it. Um, it's a funny sort of thing, that sort of rhetoric has completely left our well, no, it hasn't completely left our politics, has it? Um, what's the name of Victoria Newland's husband? I forget the name of this guy because his name isn't Newland, it's something else. Robert? I
Robert
forget.
Robert Robert Kagan's his name.
Robert Kagan, okay. He wrote some book, that used the jungle image. The Jungle Grows Back, I think is
Yeah.
the name of his book.
Yeah, America in Our Imperiled World. It was a criticism against Trump's sort of desire to not be as active on the world stage. But yeah, a very neoconservative gentleman.
Yes.
For yeah, born in Athens, but you wouldn't call him Greek at all.
Really? Born in Athens?
That's what it says,
Yeah,
according to his
he's something
Wikipedia.
else, I understand. Um,
Yeah, but yeah, he's married to American diplomat Victoria Newland, and he works for the project of the New American Century. And if you are a friend of my friend Charlemagne, you'll know that we had a stream about a CNN report on wargaming with China that was led by the project for the New American Century, and he is one of those people who helped. Start it, and very much a sort of conservative, neoconservative, I should say. It's sort of that Reagan-esque strength of military policy and moral clarity. Well, there's not really any moral authority left in American foreign policy, but that second-term Reaganism of a befuddled sense of what are we doing is still certainly alive and well.
I remember the project for the New American Century being very gung ho to invade Iraq before September 11th.
Yes.
And they just repackaged their Iraq invasion and reconstruction proposals to fit for the war on terror. They seem to have packages already made to implement for the war on terror. They were just looking for an opportunity for it. They even spoke about it in some of their papers that they had published that were freely available. I think, so far as I know, they're still online somewhere, but they were public papers back before September 11th that the United States would be galvanized by some violent attack from the outside, and they would use that opportunity to embark on new imperial projects abroad. But it all going back, that's a good reference to relevant things in modern times. But going all the way back to Coolidge, Coolidge was no isolationist, though he has maybe a undeserved reputation of being one. He intervened in Honduras and Mexico and Nicaragua, all in the 20s. Uh, British newspapers called his policies frankly imperialistic. Why did he send the Marines into Nicaragua and Honduras? He did that because they had governments that were anti-American commerce. They were trying to repudiate debts that they had contracted with banks in New York City. They were trying to limit land ownership by gringos in Central America. They were arguing about seizing American-held properties, like investments Standard Oil had made. And why were they doing these things? Well, one reason was because of the dollar diplomacy that we were talking about last time. The Americans would come in and buy the capital of the country. They would invest in new capital in the country. Now, t to be perfectly clear about this, this did raise living standards. This was an infusion of capital in very poorly developed places with lots of resources that were not being exploited. All right, there was jungle that could be turned into plantations. There were oil resources that no one had the engineering know-how or money to tap. The Americans came in, built plantations, built railroads to transport the fruit to port, built oil derricks, and started selling the oil. This brought in, well, better paying jobs than the dirt farming that was going on before. This brought in all sorts of capital and industrial plant and such that would serve these countries and improve their standard of living. But who was making the money from this? Where was the money going? Well, the working people did get money from that, and that did improve their lives. All right? It wasn't a zero-sum game. And this is where the Marxists go wrong. They interpret this sort of situation, an imperial situation, if you will. I fully admit it's an imperial situation, but they interpret it as a zero-sum game, and that is frankly not true. It is better for your country to have ports, railroads, plantations, oil derricks than not to have them. Even if all the money made out of them, the owners, the managers, the people operating these things are sending the profits back to New York City. And they were. And that caused political controversy in those countries. And funny enough, the Americans supported institutions of representative government. They did not want royalism in these countries. But what kind of policies were popular? Radical policies that involved seizing the means of production, okay? Which is exactly what happened in places like Honduras and Nicaragua. When governments claiming that their policy was to seize the property of the gringos and redistribute it. When those governments came to power, the Marines intervened. And that's a tragic story. That's not what the Americans wanted to happen. That's not what the Americans foresaw happening. That is what happened. And it happened again and again. I touched on this last time. These are the so-called banana wars of Central America, of the conflicts that General Smedley Butler led the Marines into many times. But what's really interesting about the Coolidge administration, just to move on from that, is Coolidge is he's more forceful in his policy in Latin America to maintain his understanding of the open door policy and the free flow of capital and commerce in this area while safeguarding American property. But the corporations in New York City get cold feet about it, even though this is done on their behest, at least arguably. General Butler blames them for everything. Okay. He says war is a racket. It's a conspiracy of the moneyed class to use the military to enrich themselves. Okay, that's General Butler's argument. The in fairness to the businesses and banks in New York City, they don't think that this is good policy for them in the long run. They think that knocking over the government of Nicaragua every generation is going to lead to greater resentment in the long run. And they take a policy there to be more conciliatory to those governments. They said, okay, well, we aren't the only game in town. There are banks in Europe that will lend to these countries. They've lended to them in the past. They could restore those relationships. There are markets in Europe that will buy from those countries. We could get shut out of these things eventually. And by 1931, the London Times, which had previously been very critical of the Coolidge administration as an imperial power in Latin America, by 1931, the London Times says, well, the Americans have obviously reversed these frankly interventionist projects in Latin America. But things do change by the time we get to the Roosevelt administration. We're on chapter 5 now, which is entitled "The War for the Frontier." Now, I think Williams is being he's making an allusion here. When we think the war for the frontier, we might think of the conquest of the Indians in the far west. But Williams is referring to a new frontier in foreign affairs during the Roosevelt administration, new challenges and new opportunities that come with the Great Depression and the daring new central planning that's centralized in Washington, D.C. during this period.
Yeah.
Chapter 5. Yeah, go ahead, Prude.
No, I think it's sort of interesting because we're now getting into the Great Depression and we're getting into FDR's presidency. And the things that the London Times is talking about, they still went on, but now America's Frontier, and the chapter title is very tongue-in-cheek, but also builds off the thesis, what has been said elsewhere, which is that, well, once the frontier closed to the American West, that once that frontier line had been officially closed off, there was no need for, we've got everything that we need to do now. The America as a continent is settled. And now we have to look elsewhere, and we look further and further to the West, to a point where, it would be called the Orient, the Far East. And so now a lot of that focus is now on Japan and the ongoing issues over China and Manchuria. I mean, we're still also intervening much differently. We're going to see not so much military intervention, but what might be constituted as soft power or cultural diplomacy. It sort of changes. But at this time, as the New Deal rings on, we get to see a sort of different take on the New Deal than what often gets purported as what sort of saves the country and sort of leftist political narratives. There are studies which, of course, have concluded that actually much of FDR's policies towards the New Deal extended the Great Depression by 7 years. And towards the end of the 1930s, you even had advisors telling FDR, look, either we have a complete collapse in America or we go to war. It's the only way you're getting out of this. And, well, we know what happens afterwards. But Williams tells us that the New Deal continued and developed the central approach and outlook formulated by advocates for a more corporate society, such as Theodore Roosevelt, Herbert Crawley, Herbert Hoover, Bernard Baruch, and Gerald Swope, and Samuel Gompers. While the initial necessity to grapple with the domestic crisis temporarily de-emphasized foreign policy that was made an integral part of America's economic outlook, the New Deal did not make any fundamental change in the traditional policies of economic or ideological empire. Even in the depths of the Depression, increasingly so in subsequent years, the overseas expansion of the American corporate system was considered to be the basic means of recovery and further development. Franklin Roosevelt quickly reasserted, moreover, that this kind of aristocratic noblesse oblige that his cousin Theodore had infused into American diplomacy. He had displayed a good bit of the crusading fervor for the extension of American ideas and ideals that would be characterized as the outlooks and actions of Woodrow Wilson, or what we now know today as idealism. FDR's sense of noblesse oblige gave his foreign policy a more assertive and expansive tone than was produced by Herbert Hoover or Calvin Coolidge's emphasis on efficient economic expansion. The difference did not become readily apparent until the mid-1930s, but its early manifestations can be observed from 1929 to 1933, as Herbert Hoover's response to Japan's military expansion in Manchuria was conditioned by his long-term objective of establishing a community of interest with Japan in Asia, and by his fear of war was the primer for revolution against American interests. He neither liked nor approved of Japan's actions, but concluded that Japanese expansion was the lesser evil when judged against Chinese communist revolutionary nationalism, or that of the Soviet Union. By itself, this was dangerous, but undertaken with the context of depression, it would produce greater disaster. And I think that's sort of an important context that, the economics of it all sort of said, well, Japan doing what it wants to do is way better than, say, what would break out to be the Chinese Civil War or the Soviet Union getting more involved into the East. So you start seeing the calculus for what evils are okay and which evils aren't. But on top of that, you begin to see with FDR a real change in policy, which is going to be two major things, which is the domestic reconstruction efforts with respects to, say, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation that Hoover starts, but only gets sort of expanded with the New Deal programs of FDR, but also the recognition of the Soviet Union. By offering official recognition, there's like a 20-year period from 1917 onward to where we don't really recognize the Soviets as an official government and an official state. It was 20 years of Americans sort of just accepting a Russian diaspora community, but not really doing any official business with the Soviets in the midst of a Red Scare, but also its own economic policy to focus on, well, how do we shore up ourselves? How do we build up the Western Hemisphere as well as parts of Asia for our own economic interests? And how do we instill it with that sense of American values? And this is where you'll start seeing things like the good neighbor policy in World War II, or this concept of Pan-Americanism, or the organization of American states after World War II. But despite the 1920s having this desire for peace, such as the sort of, Kellogg brand pact, we're going to have just a total renunciation of war as an instrument of national policy. Well, that never went anywhere, obviously. Secretary of State Frank B. Kellogg is not really remembered for anything, maybe but this, outside of the fact it serves as the legalistic reason for the Nuremberg trials. But it does illustrate that war is still happening. History doesn't really end, and that you still have to run an empire if you got one.
It's incredible that these proposals for world peace resurface again and again, as if people can be persuaded. It may be particularly Americans are susceptible to persuasion that we can end history somehow, that we can end the fundamental, often irrational conflicts that cause people to fight with one another, that somehow we can grow beyond that or solve people as if people are problems that we can solve, like an algebra equation or something. But nevertheless, I mean, these things don't go away, and we see this as a big part of our public discourse even now. And it's not just an American problem, but I think that it is something that comes up in American history very frequently. We see at the dawn of the Roosevelt administration a an example of an idea of previous Secretary of State and Supreme Court Justice and candidate for president, uh, really a man for all seasons, Charles Edward Hughes, um, who said that we would have an American-led peace in the world through trade and finance. So he emphasizes American soft powers, the assets that we see collected on Wall Street, the merchant fleets, a navy sent to protect trade routes. That is going to manifest that noblesse oblige that you were just quoting Williams about, and expand prosperity to poorer countries. Now, this is a big goal, a big foreign policy goal during the Hoover administration. Herbert Hoover not only pledges his masterful planning abilities to be able to solve poverty. Herbert Hoover believes he has a solution to poverty in America. This is the man who was called the great engineer. He went to um, he was trained as a miner. He got his degree in metallurgy. He traveled around the world and discovered great mineral deposits. He worked in Australia, for instance, and returned back to the United States, a multimillionaire, and then got involved with relief efforts during World War One. He saved the lives of millions of people who were on the verge of starvation in World War One, particularly starving people in the former Russian Empire. He actually had a lot to do with rescuing the lives of people at the end of World War One in the former Russian Empire. Um, and that's how he got into politics. He attended the Treaty of Versailles, and uh, which historian was it? What was it? John Maynard Keynes that said that Hoover left the conference at Versailles that creates the Treaty of Versailles. He was the only delegate that left with his reputation enhanced. That everyone else that participated got everyone's hopes up only to have them dashed. But Herbert Hoover had his reputation enhanced and seemed to be the only one that could say that afterwards. Um, Herbert Hoover said that Americans were so very well off and prosperous that they had a duty to develop poorer countries in the world. Now, this is once again returning to Williams' theme of humanitarianism as an aspect of American foreign policy. This sense of noblesse oblige, though we can see it occasionally, we can see the term used cynically, whether by the historian or by the historical character. Noblesse oblige is a real quality that aristocrats must manifest to deserve the name. And I think Herbert Hoover is an example of someone who used it as a sincere value that guided his actions. I mean, over I think anyone else that we talk about today has greater evidence for that he literally saved the lives of millions of people during World War One, and he didn't have to do it. He just had a masterful ability to organize things. But he also had weird utopian ideas, and previously I've accused him of materialism and even a kind of blindness and stupidity that goes with it, that he thought he could do things like plan the end of poverty, which is very ironic because he's president of the United States when the stock market crashes in 1929. Uh, Herbert Hoover watches a a process develop, especially in the Western world, by way uh, in the American way of life, what people see, especially in visual media, but also in things like American consumer goods, which are spread around the world. The American way of life becomes a normative vision for increasing numbers of people. And one way that is manifested is in the motion picture. And one of my favorite writers, Richard M. Weaver, remarks about this and laments that people see something normative about the insane life lived in New York City or Los Angeles, and they aspire to recreate that kind of living for themselves. And this is another consequence of the, the the growth of the American global empire. We perhaps see that more today than at any other point in history, where this life that we see represented in media becomes the aspirational way of living for hundreds of millions of people, not just in this country, but elsewhere in Great Britain, for example. Um, just to finish fleshing out the idea, uh, the growth of markets seems to be the key aspect of policymaking in the Roosevelt administration to ease things like unemployment. So, Secretary of State Cordell Hull of Tennessee is talking about this for many years. He's a faithful member of the Roosevelt administration. He's there from beginning to end, and he's always talking about improving American access to markets. Once again, we can reflect on Williams just at the very beginning of his book. He said that Americans have this tendency to think that if they can get things done in foreign policy, that will take care of their domestic problems. And so policymakers tend to emphasize the foreign aspects of American action and de-emphasize what is actually being done about problems faced at home. And here we see once again, at least in the case of Cordell Hull, he seemed to carry Williams' thesis in spite of all the frantic activity of the New Deal. Also, we see with the New Deal manifest example of Alfred Lord Keynes, the great economist, his idea that government spending counteracts the private contraction of spending during a recession. And so Lord Keynes said, just borrow money and spend it on projects. It doesn't even matter what kind of project you spend it on, so long as money is getting into the hands of people, so long as you are paying people to do stuff. It matters very little what kind of stuff you have them doing. If the government will spend the money and employ large numbers of people to do the stuff, then that will prime the pump of the economy. It's going to give, hundreds of thousands or even millions of people money in their hand that they will go out and spend. And that is going to prime more economic activity. That is Keynesianism in a nutshell, if you will. And when Lord Keynes was asked, well, what about all the debts the governments accumulate in just paying people to do whatever? You aren't really clear about constructive action here. Pay them to dig ditches. That was an example that people would use as like meaningless activity. And Lord Keynes remarked famously, "Well, we don't have to worry about the long-term debts. In the long run, we're all dead, so the debts don't matter." Now that is maybe the most cynical remark I can think of any economist ever making. But Keynes was no fool and was a very influential economist. I don't think that he could have foreseen just how far that system would go. He saw depressions ending and then prosperity afterwards, and a real economy coming back again after all of that government spending. Um, I don't think that he really considered the full implications of what his quote sounds like. But of course, I think that we see his quote much differently than he does. But we see American foreign policy during the Roosevelt administration going back to what we see during the Coolidge administration, maybe a little more, but Roosevelt is much more clever about this kind of policy making. Once again, we look back to the Caribbean and Latin America. Once again, Roosevelt has problems with Mexico. Mexico is wanting to regulate American businesses, wanting to change the concessions that they give to Standard Oil to drill in various areas, to modify the concessions that have been agreed to previously with Standard Oil. Mexico wants to cut them off at 50 years, for instance. Um, in Cuba, something very interesting happens. In 1933, the Cubans elect a man hostile to the Americans named Grau, and Sumner Wells is sent down to Cuba to try to arrange political opposition to this anti-American president of Cuba. Uh, Sumner Wells says he's going to support all the better classes in the country against Grau, and he's going to funnel American donations to those politicians um, that are willing to support American interests in Cuba. But Roosevelt dissimulates on this when reporters ask him, "Oh, is this a return to interventionism? Is this like the old imperial policy in Cuba?" He dissimulates, he avoids answering, and he prefers a more indirect approach. And I think that that's part of his cleverness, even though this is more of an interventionist attitude in Latin America. Roosevelt does successfully hide it. He avoids the charge that he's more interventionist than his predecessors. And he usually relies on the soft power aspect, where his predecessors like Coolidge would send in the Marines. Roosevelt opts exclusively to use his business contacts on Wall Street. He he freezes credit for the countries that cross him. He he sends the Navy to watch the coast and to watch the ports. So this is an intimidation factor. He ends aid programs in those countries. All of these things are the standard tools of the United States State Department today. So we can look to Roosevelt for the model for those kinds of actions. This is a fox sort of strategy. Um, and all the time, the United States is using the rhetoric and I think also a belief in noblesse oblige. They believe that they are the natural leaders in the situation, that the Cubans, for instance, they aren't capable of governing themselves. Um, they have no right to object to American policy or American investment or the removal of capital out of Cuba, the subservience of Cubans to American business interests exclusively, perhaps. Um, the Cubans are in no place to dispute any of these things. Uh, and they call that noblesse oblige. And I think that a leftist, and perhaps Williams uses that term noblesse oblige cynically. Uh, I don't want to use the term cynically, but in this case, I think that this is imperialism that ends up backfiring. Remember back in the Coolidge administration, the business interests in New York City are taking a longer view and they object to the intervention with the Marines. And we can count that to their credit. Chase Bank in New York City is so worried about United States intervention in Mexico that they send one of their heads, I forget his name. I think his name might be Darrow. He's a big city New York Chase Manhattan banker, and he is sent to Mexico as an emissary on behalf of the United States government to try to work out uh, a compromise with Mexican concerns. U.S. business knows that lording it over the rest of the world in the long run is going to be bad for America. At least they are willing to act on those convictions back then. By the time you get to the Roosevelt administration, I think that the State Department is predominating, telling the businesses what to do. And the businesses become bigger than ever as well during the Roosevelt administration. It weeds out a lot of middle-sized businesses, smaller businesses, and consolidates bigger businesses, bigger industries. And by the way, that's something that Herbert Hoover was very afraid of. Herbert Hoover did not want that to happen. He thought that that would be a very bad direction politically and economically for the United States, to have nothing but big government and big corporations. Herbert Hoover said that was the definition of fascism. Take that for what you will. But that's what Herbert Hoover believed.
Yeah, and what comes out of from Herbert Hoover to FDR, we see the emergence of what starts off as the good neighbor policy, but also sort of referring back to even the ideas of McKinley of how do we defend ourselves economically in the midst of everyone scrambling to rebuild after the worst financial crisis ever. Although that's sad 1.0. I think we haven't recovered from 2008 either. But it's sort of interesting to see how this all works and kind of how incestuous government can be. So, for instance, Assistant Secretary of State Francis B. Sayer, a law professor and the son-in-law of Woodrow Wilson, who became the chairman of the President's Executive Committee on Commercial Policy. Sayer's departmental and public documents offer an illuminating example of how public policymakers consciously accepting were acting upon the same analysis from 40 years ago in the 1890s. Sayer explained our national surpluses could not be sold profitably in this country and come to assume formidable proportions. It was becoming clear that the loss or curtailment of foreign markets would mean severe economic dislocation. Even quoted McKinley to cinch the point. And so the New Deal conception of trade as an integral part of overseas expansion of the economy had three consequences of major importance. All of them operated and influenced on events over the long run as well as during the decade of the 1930s, and all of them contributed significantly to the broader tragedy of American diplomacy and our ongoing effort today with conflict. So he says that, one, this meant that different solutions, rather than just economic expansion to foreign markets, were dismissed outright because it was seen as an outstanding need for America's financial, but also, hegemonic security. The second one meant that other nations were going to be declared as threats to them. And this is where William sort of sets up an economic thesis over perhaps, say, various other interests or civilizational concerns. For instance, he says, in the immediate context of the 1930s, as for Roosevelt, Hull, and Syria and others explicitly noted as early as 1935 that Germany, Italy, and Japan were defined as dangers to the well-beings of the United States. This happened before those countries launched military attacks or against the areas the United States considered important to its economic system. It occurred instead as those nations began to compete vigorously with American entrepreneurs in Latin America and Asia. And in the broader sense, the American outlook defined danger as any nation or group that challenged or limited America's economic expansion. The successful drive by the United States this is the second revised edition, 1962, to define any Marxist-Leninist government as alien and dangerous, is now outlawed in the Western Hemisphere, was a projection of the same basic idea of what could limit access to American markets. And then the third one, of course, was our trade philosophy. How do we engage with other countries? Our informal empire, although I think it's much more formal nowadays, it's not just the British economic policy of mercantilism. It is now a public policy that we reinforce with ourselves with these images. We sell ourselves a warm fuzzy, is what George Kennan would say in his 1950 book, American Diplomacy. We sell ourselves a warm fuzzy to justify the actions we do abroad. And so, whatever we do, we bring along our character with it. So, Williams sort of laments and says that, every time that we penetrate elsewhere around the world, we create these little pockets of modernism and modernity. And other nations begin to wonder, maybe this country is a threat. Maybe this imperial power is a legitimating concern to our own sovereignty, not just smaller Latin American nations, but also great powers, or what might be called revisionist states as well. And this is where you begin to see the formation of the good neighbor policy. How do we sell the warm fuzzy not just to the Americans, but to those that we're intervening with? And how do we do so to ensure that revolution in foreign nations, especially in Latin America, don't take place, and that we can use them to defend ourselves? This fear about economic engagement had also led to individuals of various backgrounds raising significant concerns, because Secretary of Treasury Henry Morgenthau was concerned about access, the Axis powers' economic competition. We have to expand trade with Mexico, they say, because one day we're going to wake up and find that inside of a year, 1937, he said this in December, that Italy, Germany, and Japan have taken over Mexico. And something must be done about that. We have to, get our ways to make sure that Pan American doesn't work with, German airlines in the region as well. We have to sort this out. We have to do something. And you sort of see the economic argumentation as to why we're intervening, why we're doing these things, and why it's important to keep them out of the Western Hemisphere. Both in part because of our, up until I think Secretary of State John Kerry during the Obama administration, but even back then there was still that concern that threats to American sovereignty is economic sovereignty, as well as you have to get out of the Western Hemisphere, and we're going to operate on the Monroe Doctrine. As we talked about the last episode, and as I've done a whole episode on the Monroe Doctrine, which I recommend you listen to. The earliest time it was ever invoked was during the administration of James K. Polk, almost a century prior to the 1930s and 40s, about, well, maybe we just use the Monroe Doctrine to justify invading Mexico and defending a filibuster of white settlers in the Yucatan Peninsula. Wouldn't that be nice? So you kind of see this thinking nearly 100 years later now creep into it on an economic as well as a hegemonic lens as well.
And the Monroe Doctrine is supposed to be an anti-imperial doctrine, but it is used to justify American imperial action in the 20th century. You see it all over the place. The open door policy means that the United States has this neo-colonial relationship with the poorer countries, the smaller countries, less able countries, especially in the Western Hemisphere. They become financially dependent on Wall Street. Now, like I said before, it's not a zero-sum game. They get something out of it, but they also become client powers, right? They become very dependent on American businesses. They are sending their tax revenues back to Wall Street for interest payments on these big debts. We've seen this story many times. This is just the first iteration of, well, it's not even the first iteration of this story. I mean, we can go back to antiquity for things like this, but this is a major iteration in American history anyway, where the United States is the imperial power in this case. The wisdom of the time, going back to my reference, Charles Hughes, the Secretary of State, sometimes presidential candidate, saying that this was going to mean an enduring period of peace. The interconnectedness, the commercial connections, the financial connections is going to mean durable peace. Williams comes back at that idea saying, in fact, it, it meant that conflict was coming, conflict was inevitable. And of course, Williams Williams begins his book way back in his introductory chapter by talking about the Cuban Revolution and how this is the fruit of American interventions in Cuba. The Grau administration that I mentioned a moment ago was replaced with American assistance in an election, but there's a lot of election interference going on. Understand, um, American troops are not on the ground, but there are American diplomats orchestrating things behind the scenes. This is like a color revolution in Cuba. Grau was replaced by Batista, who, as we know, had a lot of authoritarian tendencies and is also finally overthrown by Fidel Castro. But that's the sequence of power in Cuba. So when he makes the allusion to Roosevelt and Grau in Cuba and Roosevelt's use of soft power there, we know that's a foreshadowing of what's to come with the final fall of Cuba to very hostile anti-American forces. And we still see the results of that today. There is still an embargo on Cuba now. Um, this is another aspect of Williams' thesis that I found very compelling, that the open door policy leads to war. The excess of soft power leads to leonine responses. Eventually, someone is willing to strike in response. And civilian ends, um, the civilian control over American foreign policy and their use of military assets for those civilian ends ultimately has a reverse, and it means military is engaged against military. There's eventually a breakdown in that relationship, and it means war. And this is also described as tragic by Williams. This is not the intention of the policymakers. They are getting ruin and destruction when they are thinking about prosperity and peace. Now, in the midst of these these uh, these these new policies in the Roosevelt administration and during the New Deal, we see a famous investigation in Congress by Senator Nye from North Dakota. I believe his name is Gerald Nye. Senator Nye has a committee during which he investigates the armaments industry for their influence on American policymaking. It's a fascinating investigation. We remember Eisenhower's famous farewell address, where he warns of the influence of the military-industrial complex over the United States government. Well, Senator Nye was investigating that way back in the 30s. Nye proposes a radical new policy to avoid international conflicts in the future. And he proposes the old Jeffersonian embargo. He says, it, kind of reinforcing Williams's thesis. If we don't have large financial dealings, if we do not have extensive dependent trade relationships, we won't get drawn into conflicts abroad. Now, this is definitely an extreme position, and Senator Nye does not get support for this. But we are also reminded, what sort of policy do we want? Are we willing to risk involvement in another world war in order to maintain our financial dominance? In order to bring in profits of loaning out money on interest around the world? Having American products for sale all over the world? Obviously, that makes us prosperous. Obviously, that makes us rich. Those relationships are good for us materially. They've increased our living standards. No one would deny it. But what is the price of avoiding these foreign adventures that the early presidents warned us about? Senator Nye agreed with the likes of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and said it was a price he was willing to pay in order to avoid a repeat of the slaughters of World War I. But he didn't have anyone backing him up on that. Instead, Congress decided to expand the Navy. Now, this is the years leading right up to World War One or World War II, that is, and Congress decides to expand the Navy with the conversation among the senators being this is what is necessary to preserve the integrity of our trade routes around the world. We have to have the Navy patrolling the oceans, guarding our trade routes because this is such an important policy. Obviously, um, there is a fear also among the men in the New Deal administration. There's a fear of policymakers and congressmen that if the United States pulls back from interventions and involvement from pushing further expansion of markets around the world, that they will turn to an isolated domestic scene and institute a totalitarian regime. They will, instead of controlling Honduras, for instance, they will turn and start regimenting the lives of American citizens. They will start forcing and regulating, making rules, centrally controlling the economy of America in order to keep itself contained. That is the fear of a lot of the New Dealers, and that's a very interesting thing because when we look back at New Deal policies, we rather think, well, that's exactly what they are doing. Like the National Recovery Administration, the NRA, is setting prices, for instance. Is it's trying to regulate all sorts of things that the market determined freely before that time, and it's kind of a unique experiment in American history. It's eventually declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, but that's the kind of thing that the New Dealers are up to domestically. It seems to me they're already doing really outrageous things, legally questionable, unconstitutional sorts of things domestically. But their fear was if we don't pursue expanded markets abroad, we're going to unleash intolerable regulations at home. And I thought that that was a very interesting fear. Why not fire the lot of them so they stop making rules for us? I'm sure that might be unpopular as well. Americans wanted Roosevelt to do things. And Americans also love the warm fuzzies that George Kennan talks about. Americans like to think of themselves as a humanitarian force abroad. Americans call the president the leader of the free world, right? We like our image of ourselves. We live by those myths, in fact. These myths, these stories that tell us how the world works. We have a story that tells us what America is in the world, a moral force for good, right? America has the power to make the world over again, as Hillary Clinton reminded us. And I think Ronald Reagan. I think Ronald Reagan said that as well. Am I wrong?
He had said something similar along those lines. I think it's
Because
also really important in respect to because Williams will say in the previous chapter that there's this myth of isolationism, and keep in mind that there was, of course, the America First Committee, not the America First that is colloquially known online these days, but sort of the anti-war sentiments of the mid to late 1930s. Gerald Nye, who Bagby had referenced, was had famously investigated the munitions, and his thesis was that greed and would be the way in which we would be dragged into another war. So we have to investigate how greedy were our armaments people, during the First World War. And he was also investigated uh, by quite a few people. One of them by Isaiah Berlin during the 1940s. That he had said that Senator Nye was a notorious fire-eating Anglophobe isolationist. Even that early in the 20th century, the word phobic being used as a way to say he hates something. But it's kind of interesting in my respect. Calling him a fascist and works closely with individuals like Wendell Willkie and the rest of them. Of course, Isaiah Berlin's has his own sort of infamous sort of issues when it comes to being more Russian and also being particularly anti-American in that respect as well. But it's interesting just to keep that in mind, that this is happening all around. And at the same time, the governments, despite the America First thing, despite the Lindberghs being rather famously pro for the regime in Germany, the American government and still the majority of the people were all for, you know, this sort of moralistic pluralism that will somehow get us to win the war and to win over the hearts and minds of the rest of the world, while we get to expand our markets, and we'll do exactly what's necessary. And as we look at this, we get the message sold to ourselves, of course, that power, of course, is still, in theory, it's still in the hands of the civilians that control things. And of course, it's in the hands of managers and bureaucrats. And Williams will tell you that as we get closer to World War II, as he writes, that the debate was concerned that by 1935, whether or not you could work out some kind of compromise with the Axis powers. The discussion then shaded into an argument about whether the effort to remain neutral in another war would lead to an economic depression through the loss of overseas markets. Then in 1937, the majority, who still held that it was feasible to arrange some kind of accommodation without war, began to divide whether or not to accept or coerce the Axis into acceptable settlements by using economic sanctions as a threat short of military force. If not, actual use of combat would happen without a formal declaration. Finally, in 1939, after the Nazi victory over Poland, there opened a final argument whether or not it would be necessary for the United States to become a total and formal belligerent. Though that angry debate was settled by the Japanese, it seems apparent that the policymakers and the public were reaching, however reluctantly, the conclusion that war was necessary, although a draft did have to be invoked in order for that to get along. There was still significant concerns how much we needed to get involved until 1941. He says, however, a detailed reconstruction of that evolution of our trial into arms has yet been made by any historian or group of historians. Keep in mind, this book was published in 1959. But this is
And
sort of the position that he gives. Yeah, go ahead.
we're reminded, and Williams does go back to World War One to refresh our memory of what happened then, how the United States was drawn into World War One, the trade relationships that we had with Britain and France in World War One was ultimately a major factor in drawing us in, because the business community was loaning money and selling goods on credit to the belligerents on the allied side, the Anglo-French alliance on the western side of Europe. And the United States was partly split between France and Germany. There were mostly German Americans of German extraction that were in favor of the Central Powers in World War One. People like H.L. Mencken that spoke out in favor of the Kaiser. They were a minority. They never really had a chance of swaying America to intervene on behalf of the Central Powers. Um, and of course, most Americans are sympathetic to the Anglos simply because they share the same language. They can read newspapers from London. But those those business relationships and the fact the United States decided to make money off of World War One by selling things to just the Western belligerents. They couldn't sell things to the Central Powers because they were blocked off by the Allies. And by the time you get to Wilson's second administration, they realize if the Allies do not win this thing, we are going to be seriously damaged economically. We are never going to see a cent of all those loans that we made. And that is a major factor. We have the evidence of Woodrow Wilson on the phone with big bankers in New York City, telling him what exactly is going to happen to American banking if Wilson does not guarantee the Allied victory in World War One. And so this is undoubtedly, I mean, Williams does mention World War One when he's talking about the lead up to World War Two and American concerns and American memories in the lead up to World War Two. The United States is obviously favoring entry on side of the Allies. The trouble with the Roosevelt administration is Roosevelt is definitely pro-war. He's certainly wanting to intervene much earlier than he does. Arguably, and I'm not trying to open up a can of worms here, arguably he deliberately instigates the attack on Pearl Harbor. He arranges things there so that the attack comes off as a surprise. He certainly deliberately provoked Japan in the months leading up to the war. He wants the United States to intervene, but the Americans are dead set against intervention, dead set against participation. Americans are still very hostile to wars in Europe, wars abroad. They do not want to be involved in another global conflict. And so Roosevelt has this uphill battle, um, even deliberately spreading obvious lies, like his claim that he had in his possession a map of the Americas drawn by Hitler's government, and claimed that Hitler's government was going to ban religion and instead replace the use of the Bible in religious belief with a copy of Hitler's memoirs, which was preposterous and untrue. Whatever we might think of the mid-century Germans, Roosevelt's claims on those occasions were untrue. He did not have in his possession a map made by the Germans divvying up the Americas between the Japanese and the Germans. Such a thing did not exist. Roosevelt got on the radio and said that he had one. That was untrue. And the thing about replacing the Bible and replacing the cross with the swastika, that was also manifestly untrue. There is no evidence of that. Roosevelt deliberately lied, and he did that for propaganda purposes to try to get masses of Americans to become animated to join the conflict on the side of Churchill. And I'm not here to say whether or not that's what should have happened earlier or whatever. I'm just saying that Roosevelt had a secret policy in this case. He wanted to get involved, and his voters did not want to get involved. And so Roosevelt tried to change the formula. He tried to change the minds of his voters, and he did that by lying, among other things.
He's sort of been lying since the beginning of his administration.
Yeah, just kind of winging it.
Yeah, I'd recommend reading The Revolution Was for those who would like to know how much FDR lied as soon, to get into office and then did exactly the opposite of what he promised. I do think it's also interesting that how Williams details what I would almost call economic naivete. I mean, for anyone today would understand that economics and foreign policy are just so intrinsically related, or that there are consequences to just basic market actions, especially on a global scale. But it's I'm going, this is from page 194 and 195 of the book. And I'm going to try and go through this quickly, but I think it's kind of important to consider as we look at how we get closer and closer to Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt seems to have considered, however briefly, a more positive response to this overture, but his final instructions followed the pro-Japanese line. He defended his choice by arguing, short of war, that Japan could have stopped by arranging a truce with China. This is the ongoing Sino-Japanese war. Even so, American policy at Brussels was based on the extracting extensive concessions from China. It may be that the president had even concluded that war was all but inevitable and was only buying time with a down payment provided by the Chinese. It seems more probable and likely, however, that Roosevelt and Secretary of State Hall felt that unilateral American economic and military pressure would force the Japanese to retreat. There had been no doubt encouraged in this traditional assumption behind the strategy of the open door policy by the speed at which Japan accepted Americans' demands for apology, reparations, and promises for a future in connection to the sinking of the Navy River gunboat Panay, December 1937. There is no doubt in any event that the United States proceeded very quickly after the Brussels conference to reassert and act upon its frontier, expansionist outlook and traditional strategy of the open door policy. Hull clarified with one blunt remark February 19th, 1938, shortly after the administration asked for a huge increase in naval construction. There can be no military disarmament, he explained, without economic appeasement. Only healthy international trade will make possible a full, stable domestic economy. And by healthy international trade, Hull obviously and exclusively meant trade defined in American terms. Assistant Secretary Sarah reviewed the events in 1937 and 38 more laconically. Quote, the world became a battlefield in which the issues were sometimes political as well as economic, end quote. And the military as well as political, he might have added. But the most classical explanation of the crisis was offered by William S. Culbertson, who had begun his service as an economic advisor and policymaker on trade matters to President Woodrow Wilson and continued to exercise such influence in the 1920s and was active in the New Deal period. He said, our economic frontiers are no longer coextensive with our territorial frontiers. No one ever offered a more succinct description and interpretation of the single most important aspect of American diplomacy in the 20th century, either in general or pertaining explicitly to the nation's involvement in both world wars. And at this point, they're debating about expanding the American Navy, which, of course, this is offered on sort of that old idea of gunboat diplomacy. And they compared, of course, the American economic system to the British Empire. Senator David I. Walsh and Senators Tom Connolly stressed that most importantly. And they had said any delay in building a big navy would court final surrender to the country. We cannot build battleships in a time of war unless we can keep the trade routes open to bring in the manganese. We cannot make munitions in a time of war unless we keep trade routes open to bring certain essential raw materials. Backed by such leadership and logic, the bill passed the House of Representatives 294 to 100 and the Senate 56 to 28. And I think that's sort of an important thing to keep in mind. We need to keep our trade routes open. We need to get access to these raw materials to build our munitions. That way we can keep the peace. Open trade, open peace. But that has to be carried alongside our desire to maintain our war footing as well in order to defend ourselves. And I just find it interesting that I understand that we don't have everything in America readily at hand to, build everything that's necessary for war making, in part because I think there's a lot of environmental regulations that stop it. But it is interesting to listen to these two senators argue and enforce the point that we do need this, vast, expansive economic network to do it because we can't build it at home. We don't have that stuff for munitions. We don't have these things for these raw materials. And it kind of echoes very similar today about the debates over Ukrainian aid or Taiwan. We need the semiconductor factories. We don't have that here in America. We don't make anything. Therefore, it has to be over there. And it's sort of been this logical conclusion to the tragedy that Williams has been outlining in this book that, we have to maintain the open market abroad. That way we can keep things running and afloat nice and peacefully domestically at home.
We have to export entire industries in order to have lower prices and increase our standard of living. that's another aspect that is, in retrospect, very tragic. I don't know. It doesn't even have to be in retrospect. There were those at the time that were saying it's a very bad idea. It's funny. These New Deal senators are talking about obscure materials that we do not have here in the United States, and that's why we need to maintain global trade. We are so much worse off now. We don't even have a textile industry. We can't make our own socks. And that's absurd. There's no reason why we can't have our own domestic textile industry. We've had a textile industry from the beginning, from colonial days. And it was only in the last 20 years, the last textile mills are getting shut down and shipped off to Central America, to China. China got most of it, I suppose. Uh, This this is hubris. Uh, the idea that the central planners in Washington, D.C. can prepare for every expediency, every circumstance, and they do not learn from their failures to anticipate previous circumstances, previous tragedies. And Williams builds on that theme, and we see it in the title of chapter 6, which is titled The Nightmare of Depression and the Vision of Omnipotence. So the Depression is arguably the largest policy failure in the history of the United States. It certainly causes uh, suffering of millions of Americans. Just quantitatively, I suppose it might be the biggest. If it's not the Civil War, of course, many more people die in the Civil War, but it's a policy failure, at least in some respect. And we also know the New Deal is this grab bag of policies. It's not coordinated. There are two distinctive grab bags of policies: the first New Deal and the second New Deal. They they fund all sorts of mammoth programs that counteract any positive thing the first policy was supposed to do. The second policy is doing something that counteracts the good of the first policy and just digs a bigger hole by the end of the day. Scholarly opinion is that Roosevelt botched this. The New Deal did create a number of popular programs that are still with us, notably the FDIC, federal deposit insurance on bank deposits, and the Social Security Administration is another one. Also, lots of public works projects. I mean, back in the New Deal, at least the federal government could manage to build substantial things that could be appreciated for generations to come. Our government now spends trillions of dollars and no one knows where it goes. There's nothing to see. It goes down some dark hole somewhere. It buys derivatives. They're bailing out General Motors with it somehow, right? They're trying to increase um, mortgage credit availability. You know, the money that's spent now is spent on such abstract nonsense, if it isn't all corruption, that we don't see it manifested in the physical world. But during the New Deal, there were dams going up across the country. There were post offices being built everywhere. There were grants to build public buildings. There were public art grants. There were history books written that we still highly value today. Um, and that, at least, I'm not a total hater of the New Deal. There's an awful lot going on that I certainly appreciate. The Blue Ridge Parkway is worth something. Okay,
The Hoover
I like
Dam's
it,
worth it.
absolutely. The Golden Gate Bridge, right? These are things that we really appreciate. It gives us all sorts of symbols and valuable things that we still enjoy. I like the WPA murals, even if there were communists behind it all. Um, but the The idea behind the New Deal was similar to that of Herbert Hoover. All right. We have it in our power to make the world over again. We know what it takes to solve the problem of poverty forever. When in fact, the Depression should have been the nemesis moment, the moment of downfall, where the tragic hero realizes he's gone wrong. It should have been the moment of realization. It should have been a moment of repentance, a sobering moment, rather than incentive to grasp for omnipotence. And that's exactly what happens. The Roosevelt administration is convinced that they can do more than that's ever been done. They can win what's never been won, right? And at the beginning of the chapter, Williams says Roosevelt not only is he going to remake the country domestically, but he dreams of a new League of Nations, one that he will design. And naturally, he imagines the United States will be preeminent in the world, and he's correct in that. The United States does become preeminent in the world after World War One. He has a theory which he rests on the experience of many generations at this point of constant expansion abroad. Now, this is something that uh, an American critic, James Howard Kunstler, referred to as the ideology of the cancer cell, the life form that does not know when to stop. It just keeps growing and growing and growing, and eventually kills its host, of course. But Kunstler was referring to American domestic development, like real estate development, like the endless sprawl that you see around American cities. It just grows and grows. It absorbs the countryside. It defaces the land. It's ugly. Who is a sincere fan of strip malls? Um, this is a concept that's deeply embedded in modern America. And it's not, an organic harmony. It is, an aggressive assault, right? It's an assault in the sense of foreign policy. We conquer all the frontiers, we break down all the barriers abroad, but we also we're breaking them down at home, and I know that's a separate subject, but in order to love our country should be lovely, is what Edwin Burke said. And I sincerely agree with that. I do not like the development of our land that defaces it, that makes it worse than it was before men began to till it. We used to be able to build things, and this is what a lot of modern leftists don't understand. They don't appreciate that human development on the land can improve it. We can take care of the forests. We're supposed to care for the animals. We can make them better. A forest tended by human beings can be better than the natural forest. Uh, and also we often forget because we live in such an age of overwhelming ugliness. We forget that the built environment of a city can be one of the great adornments of the earth, not just a beautiful thing for daily life, but something that you travel across the world to see because it is so very beautiful. A city itself can be a work of art. But we forget that because Houston is revolting, right? We don't like the sprawl and no one should. Um, but Rome is so lovely. And we can expand in such a way that makes things better. And it doesn't have to be aggressive. It doesn't have to be an assault. It doesn't all have to be exploitative. Yeah. and when it falls down, it doesn't have to poison the land forever. You don't have to dig all the little bits of asphalt out of it so that you can have a garden there, or grow hay or something, right? It doesn't have to damage the land like that. But perhaps we've forgotten how to expand in a beautiful way. I'm just reflecting here. I'm sorry, I'm getting off track.
You're fine, Mr. Bagby. I do note how quickly though Williams kind of just skips over the war period. He does talk about the consequences of the war coming to an end and how FDR and later Harry Truman have to deal with it. But it's such a jump between these chapters about the war, because the last part of the war about the frontier is basically a convergence of thinking among corporate policymakers encouraged FDR to act more openly. It continued to lie about and conceal all of its key policy decisions, but Roosevelt Secretary of State Hull felt strong enough by September 1940 to embargo aviation gasoline and end iron shipments to Japan. Germany's rapid conquest of France brought even more support for their policies. Hitler might be said to have provided the deciding vote that the Senate passed its first peacetime draft the same month, September 1940. Thereafter, the events and decisions moved at an ever-accelerating pace. Within a year, on September 4th, 1941, the United States was engaged in an undeclared naval war with Germany. Japan attacked 3 months later. And in turn, it was made clear by the Roosevelt administration that it was dominated by men whose personal experience and intellectual outlook were conditioned by their careers as agents or students of large corporations. Dean Atkinson, Averell Harriman, Donald M. Nelson, Edward Stidonius, Adolph A. Burrell, John Foster Dulles, Eric Johnson, Paul Hoffman, William C. Foster, and James Forrestal are all but some of the most obvious names of the top layer of American leadership and of foreign affairs shaped by their time in FDR's world and in World War II. And then immediately it opens up towards Roosevelt and Stalin confront the dilemmas of victory in Europe. And that's where we jump to, is what do we do now? And how do we reassert our open door style of economic expansionism in post-war Europe? And that's sort of an interesting jump, that the war sort of gets skipped in a lot of respects. And instead, we're jumping straight into the Cold War. And so much of this does illustrate that there is a large amount of Soviet influence on how America is going to interact and how do we maintain trade. He doesn't do a lot to sort of illustrate how much of an ear Stalin had towards FDR. We really don't get that until we get the illustrious volume of Stalin's War by Sean McMeekin, which I'll be covering in November with Raging Mandrill. It's going to be a 3-part series of that book, and just the sheer level of Stalinist and communist influence on FDR during this time, because we are giving them tanks, guns, oil, aircraft, corn to fight them. And one of the only big debates that was really happening for FDR was, well, prior to us entering the war, maybe we let those two get into the conflict and we just give them both money and foreign aid and let the Germans and the Russians kill each other to mutual exhaustion. But America's dragged into the war, and that changes instantly as we're at war with both Germany, Japan, and we're now tentatively allies with the Soviets. But as the war ends, the Cold War kicks off as soon as the war ends, and if not even earlier, as there's espionage and the selling of secrets from the Americans over to the Soviets. And it's kind of funny that Oppenheimer film just came out, and that totally the hero of that story, I think, is Boris Pash, but nevertheless, we don't get that story.
Is Boris Pash, is that Robert Downey Jr.'s character?
No, that's
who's out to hunt reds?
No, Robert Downey Jr. is part of that committee. Boris Pash was played by Casey Affleck, but Boris Pash is the guy that Matt Damon warns Oppenheimer, saying, "Listen, that guy is the son of an Orthodox bishop who went back to Russia to fight the communists." And
Oh,
that guy hates
wow.
communists with raging guts, and was investigating Oppenheimer, and trying to find out how much of a fellow traveler he really was. Yeah, I wish his story would get told, because that guy's far more interesting than this neurotic film that ended up coming out of it. But yeah,
Well,
definitely.
I confess I haven't seen Oppenheimer yet. I want to see it. I love Christopher Nolan, but that's why I asked. Well, you mentioned Harry Truman. His idea as senator from Missouri at the time was, let's fund the Nazis and the Soviets and watch them fight each other to the death and kill as many as they can of one another. And that was his cynical take. Uh, Truman definitely had better instincts about the Soviets than Roosevelt did. And this is where I found myself most suspicious about Williams, because Williams does have these leftist sympathies, and Williams occasionally talks about Stalin's hope that the third world is going to see the success of communism and see that there's an alternative to American capitalism. And that may actually be the voice of Williams speaking in the text. That may be his genuine sympathies there. Um, Williams Williams also gives Roosevelt a pass when Roosevelt is apparently collaborating with Stalin, or is naive and allowing Stalin to get his way when he should have been putting his foot down, with the lines drawn in Eastern Europe, for instance, the Yalta Conference. Um, I am of the opinion, and I'm curious of your take here. I'm of the opinion that Williams himself is naive about communism in this section. That Williams is, I don't think he's ill informed here. Um, Williams is, no doubt, Williams is aware of the controversies around Alger Hiss at this point. He's heard the accusations from the House Un-American Activities Committee by the point he's writing this book. I'm sure he's aware of all of that, but I am not going to accuse him of bad faith. A man, especially a man like Williams on the left, can legitimately claim to be unconvinced by all of that at this time when he's writing this book. But I think Williams is very warm towards the Soviets, and I don't think that he really has a right to be. What do you think about his tone in this part of the book? Because this is the part where my antenna are sensitive to Williams' biases.
Well, my knee jerk reaction really to the thesis that it's all about expansion to markets, man. Kind of this sort of knee jerk reaction that capitalism is at fault, or that the American model, or the way in which our business growth is the real cause of things. Um, I mean, there's a reason why, if you were to look him up right now, Bill Williams' Wikipedia page puts him as a leftist, and I think that that's very much the case. And this part is on one hand, when this book is published, Stalin's been dead for what, 2 years? He died in 57, right? Um, but also at the same time, how much of what we know now about Stalin, the spies, etc., is known? I can cut him a little bit of slack by maybe the lack of information at the time, but
Yeah,
when your thesis, however, is building off of the general, because it's a British guy who writes about imperialism in 1910, which is sort of the foundation for a lot of. I'm going to look him up real quick, because it's going to bother me if I don't know his name. Uh, but he wrote. I got to go find it. British. But anyways, he was the one that would inspire a lot of the understanding of, both for Marxists and Leninists to say that, hey, actually, no, it really is market interests that drive imperialism above all else. And Williams buys into this concept of imperialism and the study on it and came out in 1910. And you still see this today with like Wallerstein and other sort of maybe Marxist systems theories of how we operate with markets. And even to this day, it gets talked about from everyone from the late Robert Mugabe to the late Hugo Chavez, and said these things in Venezuela as well. So I, I get, I'm always like a knee jerk reaction. Like, I don't, if this really, I mean, it's a natural thing. I get it. And but it's framed in this leftward leaning. Whereas to me, I'm more realistic about it and be like, well, yeah, that dims the brakes, kid. This is what's going to happen when empires go to war with one another. Or they seek resources. There's a whole book by Dale Copeland about, economic interdependence and war. Like, this is how it operates. But here he's just, this is where I see the little, and this is where I see that K line that I was talking about last time you were on, about this is where I see the paleo conservatives sort of ironically emerge from, because the book will conclude where there are two things that he'll conclude on. He concludes on, as long as we keep doing this, the nuclear deterrence that we have won't matter because we're going to eventually engage in some kind of existential conflict with the Soviets. And even if you have second strike capability, what's the point? And that's still a legitimate concern that gets debated even to this day. There's a great book on that called The Spread of Nuclear Weapons, a debate renewed with Scott D. Sagan and the late Kenneth Waltz. But then he concludes also with saying things like this, we have to ask ourselves if we're really so unimaginative that we have to have a frontier in the form of informal empire in order to have democracy and prosperity at home. It's time to stop defining trade as a weapon against other people that we have disagreements with. It's time to start thinking of trade as a means to moderate and alleviate those tensions and improve the life of other people. It's time to stop defining trade as control of markets for our surplus products and control of raw materials for our factories. It's time to stop depending on so narrowly in our own thinking as well as our practice upon an informal empire for our well-being and warfare. It's time to stop saying all of the evil in the world resides in the Soviet Union and other communist countries. It's time to admit that there is good as well as evil in those societies and help set an increased amount of good. It's time to start admitting that our own intelligence reports means that the Russians have been following a defensive policy in nuclear weapons. And it's time to take that attitude on their part and break out the neurosis about a Pearl Harbor attack and go negotiate an arms control measure. So I do think that those are some interesting bits there. They get my antenna all wrangled up about Williams. But, some of those stuff, I see the neocon, or not the neocon, I see the paleoconservative through line of like, well,
Yes.
sanctions don't really work. And we see that even today with our ongoing sanctions regime on Russia.
Yes.
So there's truth here. And I don't think that
Yes.
this is why you can't dismiss Williams. But I still get it's uncomfortable territory. And maybe that's because I'm forced to challenge my own preconceived notions about how the world works, or my reading on other people that aren't as maybe new left as Williams was in the 1960s and 50s.
Well, I'm inclined to say Williams handles this with grace, and we ought to remind ourselves when reading Williams on the Bolsheviks, when reading Williams on Stalin and Stalin's relationship with Roosevelt, we should remind ourselves he was writing it in the 50s. So that I think that makes a difference, and he handles himself with grace. He doesn't say anything egregious. Though I wonder about his sympathies at times. What I have what I am more impatient with is the American officials. For one, American statesmen in the 20th century are always talking about running the world and running the world to absurd ends, like making the world safe for democracy, waging a war to end war, and in Roosevelt's case, arguably, and this is one of Williams' more ballsy points, if you will, that Roosevelt wants to make the United States the sovereign of the world. And this is ultimately the point of the argument or disagreement between Roosevelt and Stalin. Now, I think that that is a truly insightful point, and in retrospect, fully validated. I think when Williams made that point initially, it was very controversial, even something people would become extremely indignant about. Now I think it is obviously true. And that's the establishment of the regime, international regime that follows, that we call the United Nations. It is dominated by the United States and proxies of the United States, countries that when the institution is established, arguably have independent voices. But if we look at the negotiations at the Dumbarton Oaks Conference, in fact, that produces the United Nations Charter right at the end of World War II, we see very cynical things going on there. Uh, Stalin's emissaries attempt to artificially inflate the power of the Soviet Union in the United Nations. The Soviet Union is going to get seats on the Security Council, or they're going to get one seat on the Security Council. And Stalin attempts to inflate the numbers of Soviet representatives by saying the SSRs are all independent Soviet republics, so every one of them should have a seat. Belarusia should have a seat. Georgia should have a seat. Kazakhstan should have a seat, right? And the American delegation gets word of this. Oh well, this is about to be proposed, and so the American delegates then say, "Oh, if the USSR is going to do that, we are going to announce that all 50 American states are sovereign, and they all deserve independent seats, whether on the Security Council or in the General Assembly." And this shuts down the Soviets on the subject because they arguably the American states have a better right to that than the SSRs do. I am very amused with that story. But not only are the Americans also proposing utopian schemes to run the world, like the Soviets are doing, by the way. All right, they're both those are both radical ideological proposals to run the world. There aren't any moderates out there, not any that have any say, and that is very frustrating to me. So I'm going with Harry Truman, right?
Yeah.
Because he's mine, literally. Um, I'm actually related to him, which is kind of funny.
Oh, look
But
at that. I didn't know that.
Yeah, I'll tell you the story later. It's kind of a funny story, but yeah, he's a distant relation of mine. I'm not descended from him or anything. He's a cousin.
Hmm.
But yeah, you go with your own in this fight. But I'm also extremely frustrated with American willful blindness about the communists. And this is one of the reasons why I always included George Kennan's long telegram in my history readers. When I got to World War II, I would have my students read the long telegram and we'd have a discussion about it, a graded discussion about it. Because one of the things Kennan is doing in the long telegram is he's reminding the American brass exactly who the communists are and what they believe. And somehow the United States went through World War II without ever really reckoning with what communism was and what the record of Stalin was. These were people that never made a secret of their desire to kill all capitalists, to murder them under false pretenses, like to betray them in order to kill them, um, to exterminate religion entirely. Uh, these are the these are so extreme. These positions are just so outrageous, and yet the Roosevelt administration pretended like it didn't exist. And they should not be given a pass for that. These men were preposterous in their naivete. And this is one of the reasons why George Kennan, like stating it very clearly and simply for the Truman administration, Truman was already inclined to be against Stalin, which is something Williams admits very early. But Truman really needed a kick in the pants to reform the attitude of the State Department towards the Soviet Union. And another thing that Williams talks about, and this is a really interesting point, he talks about the Potsdam Conference right after the fall of Berlin. The Potsdam Conference is a really important event because the goals of World War II, uh, as regards Japan, were reiterated at Potsdam. Once again, the Allied powers stated clearly to Japan and to the rest of the world that their goal was the unconditional surrender of the remaining powers against the Allies. What they called, even then, they called them not the Allies, but the United Nations. The United Nations demands the unconditional surrender of Japan. And also at Potsdam, not only is unconditional surrender reiterated, which itself is a fact of enormous significance, no negotiations here. Okay. Everything is on the table. The United States can seize all property in Japan. The United States could move the Japanese people off of Japan if they wanted to. Okay. This is what the Japanese have at stake. The all the women of Japan can be removed from Japan, right? As booty or whatever. Unconditional surrender means anything is possible. Which means if there is a fate worse than death, you keep fighting. If you believe there is a fate worse than death, you keep fighting. Because anything is possible in peace, or in surrender, means that you will be humiliated in unspeakable ways. At least potentially. I mean, that's implicit in the proposition. So this is a reason for the Japanese to keep fighting. But aside from that, uh, the Truman administration gets word that the test has been successful in Alamogordo. And so Truman now knows he has the great secret weapon that he can use even against the Russians, his erstwhile allies. And so Williams notes at Potsdam, the United States attitude towards the Russians changes. And Truman starts telling the Russians how the post war arrangement is going to work. And this really takes Molotov by surprise. And they have some interesting interactions. But this also contributes to the thesis. We see Williams is uh, an influential historian as regards the thesis that the United States drops the atom bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to demonstrate to the Soviet Union what the American military is capable of. Now, that is, I think that remains a controversial thesis, but one of Williams's a man influenced by Williams. I don't know that they had any personal connection, but a man influenced by Williams named Gar Alperovitz. He wrote a masterful history, which I highly recommend, The Decision to Drop the Atomic Bomb by Gar Alperovitz. I don't know what kind of name that is. Down here, a gar is an extremely ugly fish that lives in muddy water and eats garbage. And I rather like them. They're toothy fish. They look ridiculous. I know that's not what an Alperovitz gar looks like. He's a gentleman, a distinguished historian, but I don't know what sorts of people name their sons Gar. They must exist somewhere in the world, not down here. But his history is masterful, and I'm a big fan of it. He was certainly influenced by Williams. Alperovitz does argue in part. He says the atomic bomb was used for a number of reasons, and he has very impressive documentation. Um, One reason is there is pressure from the scientific community to demonstrate. There is there there isn't pressure from the military, surprisingly. He's got the evidence from the who's who. He's got Admiral King, he's got Admiral Nimitz, he's got Curtis LeMay, he's got Dwight Eisenhower, he has Douglas MacArthur. He has um, he's got the who's who of the American military in the Pacific and the Atlantic, who are all on record opposing the use of the atomic bomb as unnecessary. Unnecessary for military purposes. It does not further the military goals of the campaign against Japan. And you also have important people like the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Leahy, traditional Navy admiral who says, "I was not taught to make war on women and children." When he hears that the bomb has been dropped on Hiroshima, he tells his secretary, "This is a dark day for America. There is a higher power, and we are going to pay for the suffering, the needless death of innocent civilians." That's all very interesting. We
Well,
see
he
the
he he
military
shows that
brass.
off. He
Yes.
shows that concern off, um, even more so in Empire as a way of life, because and this is where his leftist tendencies will definitely come out. Because who does he cite about the consequences of what we've done, other than the black writer James Baldwin? And he thinks that, if we keep this track going of Empire, James Baldwin's "The Fire Next Time" will come true. It's just a very interesting sort of comparison of where he draws that line um, in America with our foreign policy, with respects
Well,
to empire and atomic weapons and such.
well, one of Alperovitz's most compelling reasons that he proposes for the use of the atomic bomb is to demonstrate to the Soviet Union and touch off the Cold War. And Williams speculates that as a purpose here, um, talking about the breakdown of relations between the Soviets and the Truman administration and the start of the Cold War.
That I did not know. Well, I think maybe a good place to wrap up might be sort of closing with some Kennan as well that Williams writes here. This is of course about the nightmare of depression and the vision of omnipotence, where I'm on page 219 going into 220. And of course this is, we'll start here. There is one more account, moreover, that suggests that Roosevelt's position was very similar to those that wanted to use Russia's needs to win a major political and economic concession. This is the story told by James Burns in a second volume of memoirs, All in One Life. He reports that Leo Crowley, who was to terminate the Lend-Lease shipments to the Soviet Union as soon as Germany surrendered, told him of a conversation with Roosevelt that took place on about April 1st, 1945, shortly before FDR died. He told the president about a rumor that our government was considering a loan to the Soviets of $10 billion, and that he, Crowley, thought it was wise to refrain from making any loan until more was known about their post-war attitude. He said the president agreed. This account should not be taken as full proof of Roosevelt's attitude, but it does, even when evaluated with caution, support the main point at issue. It is simply not possible to account for the continuance of the open-door policy by blaming Roosevelt's successors, for the president did not carry through on persistent Russian overtures for major economic assistance to help them rebuild the shattered economy. Had Roosevelt done this, it would have been more meaningful to charge his successors or the Soviets with sabotaging his plans for the future, for it is quite true that a small group around Nelson favoring rapprochement with the Russians was opposed by a much larger number of America's corporate leaders as well as the general population. It seemed likely as well that Averell Harriman, one of the many wealthy industrial and banking leaders who supported Roosevelt, was one of the president's top advisors, one which was more influential leaders of the anti-Russian group. Harriman's natural antagonism to the Soviets was reinforced by his vigorous belief in the necessity of open-door expansion, a belief that many have been heightened even more to an unhappy experience with the Russians in the 1920s, when his attempt to control a sizable segment of the world's manganese market by developing Russian supplies ended in mutual dissatisfaction. Harriman was one of many corporate leaders, however, who had gone into Roosevelt's administration with anti-Russian views. Others included James B. Forrestal and Bernard Baruch. Of all these men were skeptical of Nelson's approach to dealing with the Soviets, were supported in their view by State Department experts such as George Frost Kennan, who was in Russia much of the time as with Harriman. And of course, this is talking about the anxiety of dealing with the Russians in 1944, but it doesn't go too much into their ongoing relationship of, still giving into Stalin, which I will offer my correction. He died in 1953, not 1957. And that J.A. Hobson is who wrote that writing on imperialism. It was published in 1902, so not 1910. So that was my issue there. But I think it's sort of important to consider that work, Imperialism, a Study, 1902, because so much of what Hobson wrote not only influenced Lenin, but influences Williams as well. But, this is the tragedy that he writes out, is that as soon as at the end of the war, our pursuit is going to set us up for more engagements with, making sure that our markets are open, to make sure that there isn't communism anywhere, and that we're going to engage them over there so we don't ever have to worry about them over here. The very similar attitudes that were brought upon by such open-door policy men that Williams describes prior to World War I and World War II, that somehow we'll be all speaking German, or that we'll all be speaking Japanese, and that we'll live in a tiny reservation somewhere in the continental U.S., and everything else will go which way or that. And, this is why you kind of have to read The Tragedy first before Empire is a Way of Life, because Empire is a Way of Life is published in 1979, right after Vietnam. And he's asking again the same questions. Are we ever going to learn? Are we ever going to manage with our tragedy? Are we going to learn the lesson? Are we ever going to continue? Or are we going to end up like Oedipus and we're going to pluck our eyes out after we've learned what we've done and who we've done it to? But alas, I don't think we've learned that lesson just yet.
It's very telling that George Kennan, in The Long Telegram, he says that the United States, in order to resist communism and to counteract communist strategies against the West, to undermine Western institutions, that the United States should turn to domestic policy and strengthen themselves culturally at home. He warns in The Long Telegram that the communist policy is going to be to set the poor against the rich, to set racial groups against one another, inflaming them with propaganda to distrust one another and attack one another. And he says that the best way to counteract this is not by throwing money abroad, but by building up confidence at home, which will attract people abroad. Now, he does say we need to prevent communist ideology from spreading, but Kennan is credited, of course, with the containment policy, the containment strategy used in the Cold War, which is the very thing that's used to justify Korea and Vietnam. Major American, even military interventions to prevent the spread of communism in those lands. Kennan immediately regrets some of his wording because it is used to justify these massive military interventions abroad, which he sees as increasing problems rather than diminishing the threat of communism. Whether or not that's actually the case, I'm not here to comment. I'm not going to opine on Korea and Vietnam right now, but it's interesting that the American brass, the State Department, takes Kennan's expose of communist strategy. And what do they do with it? They say, oh, ignore domestic things. Let's focus on foreign policy. Just as Williams alleges in the beginning of his great book, that American policymakers want to focus on what's going on abroad and want to, or are inclined to ignore what's going on at home. They think if they can organize things according to their plans abroad, the domestic scene is going to take care of itself. The problems at home will be solved. And that is not the case.
It's sort of interesting that even some more prominent, I would consider neoconservative, or perhaps maybe just neoliberal in general, that he worked for the George W. Bush's administration. But he's the former president of the Council of Foreign Relations, but he had wrote this book in 2014 called Foreign Policy Begins at Home. And Richard Haas was arguing that if America wants to succeed on the world stage in the 21st century, it really does have to get its house in order fiscally and domestically, for manufacturing, on immigration, and on the budget, on how it can survive and manage in the 21st century. If not, it's going to continue to repeat the same mistakes it has been on in both the Bush and the errors of the Obama administration. And people were saying in 2014, when then that book was published almost 10 years ago, it's crazy to think about. He says anyone running for on the blurb, it says anyone running for president in 2016 should take that into account. Well, someone did take some of that into account, building a wall, wanting to reshore things, trying to get the house in order. But it does illustrate that, the tragedy that Williams is writing about here is that you're trying to throw a 1890s solution at 1940s problems, or you're going to be throwing 1920s policy at 1960s problems, and they don't work very well. And it only gets us further entrenched abroad. And back then, it made more sense, at least to the conventional foreign policy wisdom, because at the very least, you had a pretty strong manufacturing base that could support you in what you were doing. Not so much today. We sold that out in the name of free trade, and we're now suffering the consequences of large trade imbalances. But back then, and it's funny to see Williams rant about these individuals when, for these free traders of the turn of the 20th century, were really enjoying the fact that they had the manufacturing capability and that they could sell American goods more or less anywhere that they wanted. Well, what American goods do we have now? You have about Hollywood, you have venture capital, you have social media. Data and information is really the new information war that everyone's fighting for nowadays. But when you're trying to build a new plant, there are great reports that say that it's a lot of difficulties because America doesn't have the manpower that it used to. I have a friend who works for Raytheon. He was my debate buddy in college. And, he'll tell me that there are guys there that are well past retirement age that can't quit. Not because of the money or anything, but because that expertise will be lost if they go. And they're trying to pass it along while they still can. So the tragedy, I think, is even more exacerbated by our inability to manufacture anything. So now we're throwing a 1950s solution at a country that doesn't have 1950s manufacturing, demographics, or politics. And here we are, coming home to roost.
I was thinking about this earlier this week, just contemplating the stream coming up, and it crossed my mind that I look at even characters that I have major problems with, like Franklin Roosevelt. I look at Roosevelt, for instance, and I have my preferences. We have our differences. Whatever. That's not the point. He did things. He did incredible things, and the movers and shakers of our own day seem so incapable. Even if we had competence, even if we had the will, our options politically today are so radically diminished than in the 30s and 40s, for instance, not even 100 years ago. Roosevelt was able to do things that no leader in the United States, no budget in the United States could possibly accomplish. He had more, the country had integrity, the country had cohesion then. People could band together, people trusted each other. That's another aspect of the New Deal that we really ought to give them credit for pulling that off, because they could trust each other, because they knew that most Americans would not take advantage of these circumstances. Most Americans wanted these things to actually work, however ill-conceived they were. The community spirit was there. That's just gone now. Not to mention the know-how, which you're absolutely right about. I look at our record, and I think it's like the man that looks at the piano. He's heard piano music. He's seen, maybe he's been to a concert and seen someone play the piano, but he himself does not play and knows that he cannot play and will not play, right? He has an admiration for those who can. That's my position, right? I truly respect them, and I think that we have a tremendous amount to learn from them. Also, we look at our recent record, our most recent record. We look at the failure of the war on terror. We look at the catastrophe of Iraq, the massive bloodbath that was Operation Iraqi Freedom. So dreadfully misnamed in retrospect. What happened after that? Did we learn something from that? Evidently not. Afghanistan churned on. And then Afghanistan falls apart. It's a travesty, right? It's a farce. It's so incompetently handled. No one imagines it's all going to collapse suddenly, and then it all happens on television. And at the last minute, all of those Marines are killed in the explosion. Not to mention all the Afghans that are falling out of planes in the sky and all the rest. And once again, we have an opportunity to recognize nemesis, right? To recognize we've gone too far. The State Department does not understand how to handle these things. The military is put into impossible situations. Okay, the policymakers are far more at fault than anyone in the military, who are given impossible tasks to accomplish. We look back and we see the amount of money wasted on these adventures. And what happens? Do Americans reconsider? Do our policymakers develop reticence? Do they reflect on the mistakes? No, they don't. They push ahead into the next adventure. Eventually, the disaster will be too great to ignore, and or the cost will be too great to recover from. And at that point, perhaps things will change. Tragedy is real. Tragedy is organic. We must learn from the downfall, from the tragic downfall, so that we can avoid repeating history.
We'll only find out whether that happens or not. I'm kind of excited. I don't know if you knew this, but Francis Fukuyama is writing another book defending his thesis of the end of history and the last man. And I'm actually kind of excited to know that he wants to put out another book and sort of defend itself. I think it's called Liberalism and Its Discontents. But I'm kind of excited to go through it and sort of tear it apart and think about it. But history goes on.
Think about it. We need to think about that. Is the end of the Cold War and the ascendancy of the United States, is that the end of conflict in history? That was his original thesis. He answered yes. It's the end of history. Marx said that communism was the end of history, right? That's a utopian argument. The end of drama. No one has anything to fight about anymore. We have it all figured out, right? That was what Fukuyama said the collapse of the Soviet Union indicated. So the fact that he is writing another book at this late hour, that's certainly good because people will talk about that. That means they'll have to think about it again. And it's a very uncomfortable thought. Are we really going to look at the new multipolar world and say, oh, yeah, no one has any differences anymore? Now we can all sing Kumbaya. No. It was far more likely back when he wrote his original book. But of course, he was wrong because history continues. Human beings are not fully rational. We have an irrational side. And like James Madison said in Federalist Number 10, human beings will kill each other over just about anything. And we aren't going to get rid of that aspect of human nature. Human beings will fight about everything. So how do we
Absolutely.
organize a polity that can minimize those conflicts? I don't know. It's been done a great many ways, but I'm not sure the empire-sized republic is a good answer to that question.
I agree. I don't think we've gotten. I don't think we will see. I noticed in chat someone says the real history ending has never been tried. It will only be tried when Christ returns. That's when history ends.
Yes.
Until then, strap in, kids. History doesn't end. We're gonna get to the super
History
chats.
only
And then
ends when
we'll wrap it
the
up.
author writes his last page.
That's correct. Absolutely correct. Refresh entropy, and then we will get started. Your ongoing support, ladies and gentlemen, has been makes these things continue, makes them happen. But we'll continue on. Bolero393 says for $10, the jungle Robert Kagan called Patriot Pat Buchanan's politics subterranean. Well, I'm glad Kagan is such an authority on American patriotism, having served in the military, that being the IDF. Well, I don't know if Robert Kagan served in the IDF. I do know that he's of Russian and Lithuanian Jewish descent, despite being born in Athens, Greece, but I don't know that he served in the Israeli military. But I'm not surprised that he called Pat Buchanan his politics subterranean, despite the fact Pat Buchanan is the America Cassandra, much like Kennan and Williams in a lot of respects. Joshua BB for $4.99. He says, might doesn't make right, but it does determine who's in charge. I'm generally pro-war because this problem is we get nothing for wars today. I mean, that is the big critique that Williams points out later on in Empire's a Way of Life, is that we're not getting anything out of it. The benefits that may have came in early American expansionism don't exist anymore. They certainly don't exist in 2023. But you have to defend them because we've offshored everything. We don't make anything anymore. There are no factory men. I mean, there are for auto workers and a few industries and tech, but we're not making things like we used to. And even if we did, we'd have to compete with our own petard that we've hoisted ourselves up on, which is that it's cheaper to have workers in Mexico make shit than it does here in the United States. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I can't find a source that he was. Well, I appreciate you clarifying. But he did say that about Buchanan's politics. Well, as Buchanan wrote about in Where the Right Went Wrong in 2004, that neoconservatism is primarily a foreign policy venture first, and not really a domestic one, and it is heavily predicated on America's relationship to Israel. I would recommend that you read John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt's 2008 text to the Israel lobby. Corbin says Bagby with a smiley face for $10. Well, thank you, Corbin, and I love having George on. He's great.
Let me offer an unpopular take. I said that I look at Roosevelt and I see someone capable of doing things, and I wish that people now were capable of doing things, right? I certainly look at the the state of Israel and think that they advocate for their people. I think the state of Israel, the history of that country has its own tragedies, and its own overshoots, its own miscalculations, things like that. Um, but they openly advocate for their people, and they do things to help them. And I don't see that in the West. I don't know. Maybe Hungary can manage something now and then. What other nations in the West can manage to do that much? To openly say that their government likes their own people group, and to openly scheme, at least, of things they can do to help them. I don't know anyone doing that. So, I mean, I like the spirit that shows. I like the resolve, the justice inherent in that. Even to the point that they're willing to be unjust to others on behalf of their own. I completely admit that about them. But any corporation that's going to advocate for their own in group has to be willing to step on people's toes. Has to be willing to hurt feelings. Whatever the powers of the Knesset um, are doing in that regard. I'm not commenting. I'm just saying they are certainly willing to do that. They're certainly willing to be offensive, right? I would like more of that for Westerners, just generally speaking, Western nations, for France, for the United States. And that involves like looking homeward. Once again, the theme which Williams loves. And we can say we've gone full circle now. We've talked about how Williams is a leftist, and I remember at the very beginning of our previous stream, I was talking about that, and I was qualifying that, and I was saying, well, there is a sort of leftist that we find we have things in common with, that we have similar talking points, similar priorities, and strangely, Pat Buchanan and Ralph Nader can sit down and be very friendly with one another, which is really extraordinary. I like that. That maybe that's an older America that's now all gone. Ralph Nader was an old leftist. Pat Buchanan is the old right, right? But we go full circle around now, and we notice Williams, his point that he begins with, and we end with, is Americans need to look homeward. Americans need to know what's healthy at home. Americans need to know what a healthy, happy America looks like and work for that. And that needs to be their priority over 100 countries with Marine bases, right? A Navy spread all around the world to, fly in the paratroopers whenever something happens anywhere. What's happening at home is more important. And a final reference for us before we wrap things up. There's a good book by Bill Kaufman called "Look Homeward, America," and he's writing from the perspective of a paleocon, but he wrote that right after the end of the Iraq War, and was saying, okay, now that we've had a big foreign policy disaster, now we need to reconsider, right? What are we doing with our efforts? What are we doing with our administrators, our planning genius? Let's look home. Let's fix problems here first before we go abroad and tell Iraqis how to live.
I remember that being such an anti-war talking point, that America should declare war on America and invade, rebuild its roads and bridges,
Oh,
educate the
don't give Biden
masses.
an excuse now.
I think he's too busy with some other country to be. He's invading us by other means, but
Yeah.
yeah, I just remember that being an old left talking point in that respect. Um, TB88 says for $5 US, seeing articles floating the idea of bringing the draft back. Do you think a draft would moderate military intervention? Well, if they do bring the draft back, you can expect riots like what happened in New York during the Civil War, and you'll see race riots like you saw in 2020 and during Rodney King. But I'd imagine, given how my government hates people that look like me, that it might be selective if it goes forward. But a draft would require substantial mobilization of the American population because so many people are not qualified to be in the military, either due to drugs, pre-existing medical conditions, or just flat out obesity. So I don't know how, in the current amount of slop that Americans eat and how inactive and sedentary most of us are. I mean, 2/3 of the country is overweight or obese, so you got a very small select group of people that you're working with to draft. I don't know how you overcome the numbers problem. But even if you had a draft, I don't know if it would moderate intervention. Uh, that's been a discussion that I've seen from a few military historians, but I'm not well read enough on that issue to offer an opinion further than that. TB, do you have anything there, Mr. Bagby, that you want to add?
I'll come off as callous. I don't care about my or how people perceive me um, on this matter so much. The masses of America ought to feel the pain of what they're doing, the pain of what they're countenancing from their disgusting leadership. Maybe a draft would wake some people up to the point that they realize we cannot allow these controllers in Washington to get away with doing these things. There must be an end to it. And call me a populist. I mean, that is one way ruling classes have been brought down in history, by angry mobs. And maybe that would actually do it. But if the draft was reinstituted, it would be to fight China or Russia. And that means that the fight would be over before they got on the boat. And it would be over with radioactive clouds over our major cities. I don't know, maybe that's what would anger Americans and finally get rid of this parasitical elite that's governing us in Washington. Maybe they'd get drug out of their bunkers after it was all over, rejected as they should be, while peace still governs us.
Very much what Williams probably would have thought as well.
I don't want to reenact the plot of A Canticle for Leibowitz. I really don't. But maybe that's what finally will bring the elites of Washington down.
Well, I remember, I don't know if it was Jerry Falwell or someone similar in his ilk, but he had said, if God doesn't do something to America, he owes Sodom and Gomorrah an apology. And that line has stuck with me throughout most of my life as an adult.
I believe I've said elsewhere at other times, I went to Liberty University. I met Jerry Falwell. He was a huge bear of a man with giant hands, huge, soft hands, and he would remember your name. That was a really extraordinary thing about him. He shook the hands of thousands of people, but he would remember your name, which was just remarkable. But I remember back in the days of the Iraq War. Of course, he was a huge proponent of the Iraq War. Big supporter of George W. Bush. But he would say all kinds of things that were very cringy, or at least I thought so then. I don't think so now. I was wrong in my takes on him back then. He had all these alarmist takes on the culture war, If we let this go, if we mainstream that, if we tolerate this, next it's going to be open pedophilia, on television. Uh, and back then, we laughed and rolled our eyes and said the old man's lost it. He knew what he was talking about. He had it. I did not understand. He was right. That's my take now.
Yeah, there's a comic that makes fun of types like him that was just talking about the issues ranging from contraception to gay rights and things like that, and how they were always warning that the world would end if these things kept happening. And then all of a sudden, the comic's been edited to where it's like, hey, if these things happen, the world's going to end. And then it shows like 2008 or whatever. He's like, hey, everything did happen and the world is going to hell in a handbasket. And I prefer that edit over everything else. But last but not least, Joshua Beebe for 199 says, Iraq gas station, Afghan and mineral resources, with his little hands up in the air like he doesn't know. Well, we never went after Iraqi oil. And the circumstances of us actually invading Iraq in the first time during George H.W. Bush's administration, we never really listened to Saddam Hussein's complaints that the Kuwaitis were drilling for oil that actually went in and violated Iraqi sovereignty. But hey, we invaded anyway. And then, of course, we did have that USGS survey back in 2009 about the vast mineral wealth of Afghanistan, but we never made it profitable. We never, if you want to say exploited, we never took advantage of it. But boy oh boy, are the Taliban government really eager to work with the Chinese on that issue. So I mean, even if you wanted to do imperialism, right, in the name of counterterrorism or whatever, yeah, you can't get good market exploitation out of it nowadays.
That's right.
That
I mean, the open door policy makes so much more sense than our modern imperial policy. And on that point, Trump was entirely right. Call it cynical, call it exploitative, call it, shameless capitalism, whatever you might call it. Trump said we should have gotten something out of Iraq. We should have at least paid for the operation. We should have just taken the oil, he said. And it makes more sense than what we actually did. That makes more sense because it's actually a reason to do it. I'm not saying it's a good reason. I think it's a bad reason. I'd say it does not meet the standards of a just war at all. It's morally reprehensible. But Trump saying we should have at least taken the oil and paid for the operation, that's actually sensible policy. And it won't bankrupt the country. We didn't we just went over there and burned trillions of dollars. That's literally what we did. It would have been the same if we'd put it all in a burn pile and burned it up. And that's worthless. It's counterproductive. It's blowback. It just inspires people to hate us. And that just makes everything worse. So yeah, you're right. Openly imperial policy in those countries would have been better than what we did.
Yeah, sort of the point that Trump made for sure. And then he says, I'll say it's a good reason. Well, we should have, but I mean, this is even for love him or hate him. This is the point that Mr. Bronze Age pervert was railing on about. This is that we don't have mercantilism in America. We have globalism, and it doesn't benefit the people. It's not like the empires of old. We're not even the empire of the 1950s. Like, we have definitely failed in that respect.
Well, you can tell that the empire, the imperial rulers in the 1950s, they wanted to aggrandize the United States. They did things here. They invested in this place. And they succeeded in, whatever you might think about the 1950s culturally or in relation to how you want to live now. You still look back at the image that we have of the 1950s as this time of peace, stability, universal prosperity. It's a really durable image for us. We have so many images from pop culture from that time, and not that 1950s pop music is some major cultural achievement, but it's a durable image of the good old days. And that was a time when we had better rulers than we have now.
Well, Mr. Bagby, where can people find you and what do you do?
I used to be a high school teacher. I still have a couple classes I teach online. I have a Telegram channel called Bagby's Corner. My main operation right now is driving a taxi cab in New Orleans. So I record pictures of beautiful places I see. Sometimes I take pictures of ruined places. I share experiences on my Telegram channel, and I also have a YouTube channel. If you look up George Bagby on YouTube, you'll find my YouTube channel where I read essays and poetry and stories, things from my shelf.
Well, I have those linked down below in the description. So by all means, be sure to follow him on Telegram if you're on there. Subscribe to his YouTube channel. His essays are comfortable listening to as well. I'm on the road, either driving to church or running errands. So be sure to do that. I will be live again this Thursday with Geo for another episode of the Digital Archipelago. So be sure to stay tuned for that. All my links are down below in the description. Your ongoing support via Subscribe Star, buy me a coffee, Substack, as well as here is all greatly appreciated. If you don't want to ever give Google your money, which I totally understand, that's why Entropy and all those other great alternatives are there. If you want to support me on a more regular basis rather than just when I'm live, um, we'll see you all next time for more foreign policy discussion. I will try my best to be more on current events the next time that I'm live. But these discussions are really important because we still live in this great tragedy, this great Greek tragedy that is happening in America today. So it's important to learn because if not, who's going to pass these stories along when things get worse? So with that being said, I will see you all next time. Take care and God bless. See ya.
Good night.